Today we're going to talk about the Oyo Empire and the origins of the Yoruba. Today's exercise is going to include 3 videos that you will see, and it will include a discussion of the reading that I will do when we get to the slide on the reading for today, which is Crowther. So, to begin, the Yoruba, as we know, are very important in terms of African history and also in terms of the African diaspora, particularly in relation to Cuba and in relation to Bahia in Brazil, and by extension the spread of Yoruba religious practices around the world. Those religious practices are most often referred to as Santeria. Today, of course, the Yoruba area of Nigeria and neighboring Benin is an extremely well-developed part of Africa. The largest Yoruba city is Lagos, which used to be the capital of Nigeria until it was moved to Abuja, but still remains one of the largest cities in the world. The other extremely large Yoruba city is Ibadan, which is about 80 kilometers north of Lagos. And moreover, there are many, many other Yoruba cities because the Yoruba are a very urban culture, a very urban society. The importance of the Yoruba historically can be traced especially to the 18th century when the Oyo Empire being the largest of the Yoruba states historically, dominated much of the interior of the Bight of Benin and was responsible for the deportation of many, many people to the Americas. And so what I want to do today is really talk briefly about the history of the Oyo Empire, where it came from and how it rose, and a basic chronology so that we understand what that is. And secondly, I want to talk about the terminology. Today we refer to these people as Yoruba. The language is known as Yoruba. It's spoken by millions of people, and it's without any question one of the most important influences in the modern world, is stemming from Africa, as revealed through the Santeria and its religious practices. However, before the 19th century, Yoruba was not the name that these people called themselves or knew each other by. People identified according to the political state that they were in or to whose allegiance they owed. And the largest of these was Oyo, as I've said. So let's talk about how that came into being, and then why it was that Yoruba was adopted as the name for everybody, which is something that happened in the middle of the 19th century. And indeed, the reading for this week about Samuel Crowther. Samuel Crowther himself was Yoruba, and he was one of the individuals who was instrumental in the adoption of Yoruba as a name, as a name for the ethnic group. So, the Yoruba, medieval history, Yoruba go back a long, long, long way. We can know this primarily because of the art and because of the cultural heritage and because of the myths of origin and because of the religion. In the picture on the opening slide, you see in the middle an individual who's in masquerade, and you see 2 boys with ceremonial swords, one on each side. And the pageantry and the elaborate costumes are a feature of Yoruba religion and indeed of Yoruba culture. And we know about this historically because there's been a lot of art that has survived, and indeed when the British actually conquered Nigeria and the region that is Yoruba today, they stole a lot of the art and took it back to England. A lot of it's in the British Museum and other museums in England today. And these were unbelievable artistic sculptures that were done in brass and bronze, and are in fact very famous. You'll see a few of them in the slides that follow. Now, the origins of the Yoruba mythologically go back to the city of Ife. Ife today is also a very large Yoruba city. It's the home of one of the most important universities in Nigeria, Awolowo University, and it's considered the cradle of the Yoruba. It's where it's considered that the supreme god of the Yoruba pantheon came down to earth, and that the sons of that god then dispersed and founded all of the major Yoruba towns and cities. So there is that myth of origin relating to Ife, which is one of the features of Yoruba history that provides some degree of continuity and some degree of recognition that there's a similarity in background. Moreover, there's a very close relationship to Ife and to the neighboring kingdom of Benin, not to be confused with the modern country of Benin. They're not the same at all. The Bight of Benin is the name of the water. The Atlantic Ocean is referred to off the shore there as the Bight of Benin, which is where the modern country gets its name, Benin. And the Bight of Benin gets its name from the Kingdom of Benin. And the Benin Kingdom is not Yoruba. Ethnically, it's Edo. But Benin also claims that it has it's descended from the city of Ife, and that the god that descended from heaven also founded the Kingdom of Benin. So there's a strong relationship between the two. Now, the Oyo was one of the Yoruba states. It was the most northern of the Yoruba states, and it happened to be located in the savanna as opposed to the forest. Most of the Yoruba country is rainforest, and historically, therefore, was not an area where horses could be found because of the tsetse fly and schistosomiasis that kills horses, and a large fly that infects horses and people indeed, except that horses don't have the ability as humans do to swat the flies and get them off you so that you don't get sick. So horses didn't survive in the forest. On the other hand, Oyo was centered in the savanna where there were not tsetse flies, and as a result, it was able to develop cavalry and therefore a very large military, which was able to conquer a fairly substantial area and create an empire that included areas that were not Yoruba by ethnic origin. They included Nupe, Borgu, Dahomey, Mahi, and other places that were not Yoruba, and therefore created an empire. Now, the reason it was able to do so was because Oyo was centered in the savanna, and there's a peculiar geographical feature of West Africa in this area, in which the savanna country actually pretty much goes down to the coast, to the west of the Yoruba heartland, through Dahomey to the coast, and to what became the very important slave port of Ouida, which you'll see in the video that's coming up. So this geographical feature in which the savanna cuts through the forest because of the peculiar geography is often referred to as the Benin Trough, as if it's a trough that goes down to the ocean. And it was really along that corridor that Oyo created its empire. Oyo didn't really become important until after about 1650, and as we'll see in the discussion that follows in the PowerPoint, you will see this reflected in the increase in the number of enslaved Africans who left from the Bight of Benin to the Americas. It only really takes place after about 1650, which is precisely when Oyo begins to expand. So that the chronology, we have a period in which the Oyo aristocracy is in exile, which is before 1650, but they reestablish themselves in the northern Yoruba country in about 1650 and expand from there. So the second period is really about from 1650 until really 1817. And it's in that period that Oyo is the major source of slaves from the Bight of Benin for the Americas. Now, after 1817, as we'll see, there's a crisis, a civil war, and a jihad movement from the north, which we will examine next week in more detail. Now, in terms of economics, the Oyo Empire was centered on a capital district that was located fairly far north for Yoruba, in Yoruba country, very far north, close to the Niger River. It was the capital of the empire, was known as Oyo, at the same name as the state. And because there's a later city in the 19th century that's founded to the south, which is also called Oyo, the earlier one is usually referred to as Old Oyo, while the 19th century reincarnation is referred to as New Oyo. And today, the city of Oyo in Yoruba country is very large, and it's the southern recreation of the earlier capital. That earlier capital was completely destroyed between 1817 and particularly by 1836, when it was finally abandoned. And to this day, the original site of the capital is abandoned. The area around it, which was once densely populated with many towns and cities, is now just nothing but bush country, and no one lives there. The capital, Old Oyo, was also called by neighbors and others Katunga, so that it had another name as well. That capital district was extremely well developed before the 19th century. It was heavily involved in trade along the Niger River, as well as trade right to the coast, to the south. It was a center of heavy industrial production, textiles, leather goods, different types of expensive beads that were used in jewelry. And it was most important because of its control of and domination of the slave trade to the coast. And that slave trade was, as I've said before, was really in a sense based on the fact that Oyo could have a cavalry and therefore could raid its neighbors and could capture people. And it dominated trade to the coast initially through Dahomey to the west, and then by the late 18th century through a special corridor that went down to what's now Lagos and Badagry, which is known as the Igbado corridor. And we'll talk more about that. Constitutionally, Oyo had a king. The king's title was Alafin, and that was the title of the king. And it had a ruling council, the Oyo Mesi, that was made up of the nobles who actually were warriors who commanded units of the cavalry and therefore were involved in the enslavement of people and the sale to the coast. There were a number of very interesting, indeed peculiar features of the Oyo Constitution. One, the Alafin, the king, was not allowed to go personally into war. So therefore, he could not be directly involved in enslavement, and he could not be directly involved in anything to do with the military. As a result, what the Elephant did is that he appointed an official who became his personal general, and in the end, as we will see next week, this is what got the Oyo state into serious trouble, because the generals that the Elephant appointed became very, very powerful, and by the early 19th century was more powerful than the Elephant himself. A second feature was that the Oyo Macy, which was made up of all these nobles who were actually the heads of military units, was dominated by one official, the title of whom was Basuran. These names will be available on Moodle, so you don't have to worry about how they're spelled. You can see there. But a second feature was that the Elephant had to not only could not go to war, but if the Oyo Macy decided in secret council that it didn't want the Elephant anymore, they could tell the Elephant to commit suicide, and the Elephant had to commit suicide. And there's a whole series of elephants who actually are documented as having committed suicide, in which then the new Elephant, a descendant of the other elephant, of the one who's committed suicide, would take over. So then in the end, the military leaders had the power to change the government if they wanted to. And in the middle of the 18th century, one particular head of the Oyo Macy, with the title of Basuran, by the name of Gaya, actually was able to force about 6 or 7 elephant in a row to commit suicide. And so that in effect, the Basuran Gaya became the effective military leader of the Oyo state during the height of the slave trade. This continued until one elephant came in by the name of Abiodun, who came to power in 1789, and he refused to commit suicide, which was a violation of tradition, needless to say. But in the end, he got rid of Basuran Gaya and reestablished and reasserted the authority of the Oyo monarchy in the face of the conflict with the Oyo Macy nobles. Now, why couldn't the Elephant go to war? Because the Elephant was considered to be a direct descendant of one of the gods, and his role, therefore, as you can see in the picture here, related to this feature, that he was considered above going to war, above going out of the palace, and therefore we next have to really understand the nature of Yoruba and Oyo religion, and this brings us into the cultural and religious context of the Yoruba and the Oyo state. The Yoruba worship, hold in veneration many gods. These gods are referred to as and called Orisha, so there are many different Orisha, and we will see in the videos and so on some of the evidence of all of this. Second, one of the gods was a god whose name was Ifa. Ifa was a god of divination, so that the Yoruba also very heavily believed in the divination, that is, that you could tell the future, that you could decide what was going to happen. And these various Orisha, and particularly Ifa, and the god that was most important in Oyo was known as Shango, and Shango is the god of thunder and lightning and war. Just as Ifa is the god of divination, there are all these various gods that different Orisha. We'll hear more about them. So, then very briefly, Oyo was extremely important in the slave trade. It was very important in manifestation of the nature of Yoruba religious belief and practice, and this was all tied to elaborate ceremonies that have continued into Brazil and into Cuba, and which we're going to look at now. Here are some slides that relate to Santeria in Cuba, although actually Santeria, or which gets its name obviously from the word saint, it's more commonly called Regla de Osha in Cuba, and you can is an interesting characteristic of Yoruba religion. Yoruba religion is extremely different from Islam and Christianity. Both Islam and Christianity, and indeed Judaism, have a feature which says that, you know, there's only one God, there's only one way to look at the religious world, and anything that is different is considered sacrilegious, is considered not pure, is considered to be indeed not compatible with Christianity. The Yoruba religion has a completely opposite point of view, which is that if in terms of religious orthodoxy, if anything can be shown that can actually work in terms of religious belief, then it's incorporated into the religion. So Christianity is exclusive. In other words, there's no room for, in a theoretical sense, there's no room for innovation or no room for variation from what's considered to be orthodox. While in Yoruba religion, anything that's new that can be incorporated will be. And so therefore, each one of the Yoruba Orisha, each one of the gods is associated with a Catholic saint. And so that there's nothing incompatible in Yoruba religion from believing that one particular Catholic saint, such as Santa Barbara, is the same as Shango. And they are combined, which is why it's sometimes called Santeria. And here you see Alagua statues in Cuba, and Alagua is one of the Yoruba Orisha. Here in Brazil, you see Candomblé, which is similar to Santeria. It's the name that is used to describe Orisha worship in Brazil. And please note that the Portuguese spelling of Orisha is Orisha with an X. And you see images here of the different Orisha and how they're interpreted. And you see the elaborate costumes and the beautiful costumes that are worn by Candomblé initiates who are at a ceremony. You'll see more of this in the video that we're going to see. And as I mentioned, the Ifa is the god of divination. And here you see a divination. There's a particular form of divination, which is the throwing of cowrie shells or something else, and whether they fall up or fall down, and then the person who's doing the interpretation will tell you what the future is. Here you see, I mentioned that Ife was the traditional, the mythical place of origin, and here you see the Oni, which means the king of Ife, and he's in a beaded crown. He's wearing a beaded crown. You again see the amazing artistic representation that's associated with Yoruba religious belief. These are the medieval sculptures that have survived. They go back to the 13th to 14th century, long before European contact with this region. and you can see the beauty of the artistry, which can be traced back even more ancient past, back to the ancient culture of Nok in central Nigeria, Nok, N-O-K, which terracotta, that is pottery type sculptures have been found in archaeological ruins. You see more of these bronzes. They're associated specifically with Ife from the 12th to the 15th and 14th and 15th century. These are some of the items that were taken by the British expeditions at the conquest of Ife and the Yoruba towns, and they took a lot of the religious and other objects back to England. This is the mythical site of the founding of the Oyo Empire at Oyo Ile, or Old Oyo, and this rock formation is considered to be where one of the gods appeared, who became the ancestor of the different Alafin, the different rulers of the Oyo Empire. Here's a picture of the palace of the Oyo Palace in the 19th century before it was destroyed. You can see how large it was. This is where the Alafin lived, and except for ceremonial purposes, he never left the palace, which is why, as a descendant of one of the gods, not allowed to go to war. As I mentioned, that the principal god of the Oyo was Shango, and indeed Shango was considered to be the mythical early Alafin, and that all the other Alafins are descendants of Shango, and Shango therefore is one of the Orisha associated with fire, associated with thunder, associated with lightning. And the society that was particularly devoted to him, the priest, was known as the Igboni Society. And the Igboni Society had to agree with the Oyo Mesi if the Alafin was instructed that he had to commit suicide for some reason. And I mentioned that Old Oyo, the capital, and indeed all the Yoruba towns had an industrial base. They produced textiles. Cotton was grown locally. Indigo and other dyes were produced locally. And they made these elaborate, wonderful, beautiful textiles, and indeed still do today. They made unbelievable sculptures, crowns that they wore, and you can see them here made out of cowrie shells on the left, and this elaborate artistry was in effect an important industry as well as being artistic. Cowrie shells were used as the currency of the Oyo, and indeed much of the surrounding areas. Cowrie shells came from the Indian Ocean. Initially they were brought across the Sahara, but with the slave trade they were brought by Europeans from the Indian Ocean, particularly the Maldive Islands off the coast of India, taken to Europe, and then taken to West Africa, where they were used in the purchase of slaves in this part of the coast. And so that in effect what was being done was the importation of money, the money in the form of cowrie shells, as well as other goods, tobacco, textiles, iron products, brass, all these types of things. But cowries were very important. In this case, they're being used ritually, but in many cases they were just used as money. Again, to see Oba, which is another title for a political official, a king, in this case, again, of one of the states. You see again how people are dressed. You see the ceremonial swords. You see the wealth that's displayed in terms of the jewelry that people are wearing. And here a depiction from the 19th century, early 19th century, showing the Oyo cavalry. Again, noting that horses could not survive in the forest regions, which is why Oyo captured mostly areas and conquered mostly areas in the savannah rather than in the forested areas, so that places like Ife were never conquered by Oyo, and areas to the south, Ijebu, which is near Lagos today, not ever conquered by Oyo. Here shows a map of the Oyo Empire at its height in about 1780, just about at the time when Basoran Gaya is overthrown by Abiodun, and the elephants come back into their power. Oyo, at its height, included Nupe, which is across the Niger River, included the region of Borgu, included the state of Dahomey to the west, but did not include all of this Yoruba area here. And so that while Oyo was a Yoruba state, it was also a multi-ethnic state, because Borgu is not Yoruba, Nupe is not Yoruba, and Dahomey is not Yoruba. But you see that in this period, this is the major state of the area, and it dominates the coast here, and therefore the deportation of enslaved people from the Bight of Benin. The Nupe area to the north was similar, despite linguistic difference and cultural difference, tracing its ancestry as a state back to a mythical king by the name of Zode. And you see a beautiful, very large bronze of Zode that makes this, you can see the similarities and the influences of Yoruba art on the whole region, as you can in the textiles, as you can see in what the women here are wearing. Note that all the textiles in this region were made on a narrow loom, so that you see that strips of cloth have to be sewn together to make a garment of any type. And we can even see it's claimed that some of the Orisha, one of them in particular, Ogungun, is one of the gods that came from Nupe into the Yoruba system. Again, emphasizing the point that I'm making, that Yoruba religion included things from outside. It never felt that it was an exclusive religion that couldn't adopt to change and couldn't accept new influences on its culture. And Ogungun is a perfect example of that. The other state that was part of the Oyo Empire was Dahomey, which by the 19th century becomes its independent state in itself. But Dahomey initially, founded in the interior of what is now Benin, the kingdom of the country of Benin, also had an extremely elaborate artistic tradition, and therefore was like the Yoruba area and the Nupe area, characterized by a wonderful artistic tradition. You can see here someone with a smoking pipe. This is tobacco, and pipes were imported. Tobacco was one of the most important things that was imported into this region as a result of the slave trade, not just cowrie shells. But Dahomey, like the rest of the Oyo Empire, was within this cowrie currency zone of West Africa. Dahomey initially rose to power after 1700 and became a major source of slaves, but as of 1731, it was a dependency. It was conquered by Oyo and forced to pay tribute, and therefore until the early 19th century was technically part of the Oyo Empire. One of the features of Dahomey history was what are often refers to Amazons, that is, female warriors, and there were contingents in the Dahomey army that were made up entirely of women. You see a picture here. This is actually from the 19th century, but the tradition goes back into the 18th century. And for Dahomey, and therefore for the Oyo Empire, the major route to the sea was through Dahomey until the end of the 18th century, and the major port was Ouidah, spelled here O-U-I-D-H-A, but sometimes in English spelled W-H-Y-D-A-H. It's just a question of whether it's francophone or anglophone in terms of its spelling. In the French, O-U-I is oui, so Ouidah. And it's the way the city is spelled today. It exists today. Moreover, throughout this area, and we'll come back to this next week when we talk about the jihad movement, there were Muslims, there were people who did not believe in the Orisha. The Orisha had particular characteristics that are important to recognize, which is that the Orisha requires sacrifice. In Cuba and in Brazil, that sacrifice is mostly in the form of goats and chickens and things like that. But in Africa, at the height of the Oyo Empire and in the Yoruba states, the sacrifice very often included human beings. And so people were bought especially for the purpose of being killed at these big ceremonies and these big festivals that were held, and they were considered to be sacrifices for the gods. And the people who became Muslims were people who specifically objected to the sacrifice of human beings. Muslims don't do that, and Muslims very specifically and consciously do not believe in more than one God. They only believe in Allah. They do not believe in any of the other saints or any of the other gods, so that you can see that the fact that there are Yoruba who were Muslims, you can see that there was a conflict, a disagreement within Yoruba society between those who followed the Orisha and those who did not. And we will see next week the result of the jihad movement, that is, of the Muslim holy war that completely transformed the interior of this part of Africa and also led to the complete destruction of the Oyo Empire. So that's what the Oyo Empire looked like before its destruction. Subsequently, in the 19th century, because of the destruction of Oyo, new cities were founded, this one being Abeokuta, which shows the palace there in the 19th century, which is very similar to the previous palace at Old Oyo or Katunga. Hence, what we really need to know is the slave trade, and this is a table that you're going to look at in more detail later, but you can see that before the middle of the 17th century, relatively few people came from the Bight of Benin, but after the rise of Oyo, the numbers of people increased dramatically, rising into for a 25-year period, as many as 350,000 people between 1726 and 1750, for example, and that this very large migration after the middle of the 17th century and continued right down until about 1850, so that we have about a 200-year period in which the Bight of Benin is an extremely significant source of people for the slave trade, almost 2 million people in all. You see where they go. A lot of them go to the British Caribbean. A lot of them go to the French Caribbean. A lot of them go to Cuba. Spanish America really means Cuba in the 19th century. And then also an extensive number of people that go to Brazil. And in fact, there are two periods in this. One is the the period when Oyo was the dominant state, and therefore responsible, both Oyo and its dependency Dahomey, responsible for the overwhelming migration of people from about 1650 to 1815. And then a second period, which is the collapse of Oyo and the destruction of Oyo, in which after 1817, when continues to be a large numbers of people, only now very many of the people that are leaving are people that actually had been citizens of Oyo itself. In terms of etymology and names, in Cuba, Yoruba were referred to as Lukumi, which was a Benin term from the 16th century. In Brazil, these people were known as Nago, which takes its name from Anago, which was one of the Yoruba subgroups, sub-cities that was bordering on the western side in what's now the Republic of Benin. In Sierra Leone, the people there who spoke the Yoruba language were known as Aku, which is a name that was taken from a Yoruba greeting. But among Muslims in the north, all these people were referred to as Yoruba. That was the term in Hausa, Arabic, Songhai, and other languages to the north. It was not a term that people that speak Yoruba themselves called themselves. It was a term from the north. And that term was the one that was adopted in the middle of the 19th century, particularly among Yoruba expatriates who had been taken off of slave ships and settled in Sierra Leone, and one of the most important of whom was Samuel Crowther, which brings us to the readings for this week. We'll hear more about this man, Ali Asimi, next week. He was actually from further north, but he was in the capital of Oyo at the time of the uprising in 1817, and because he was a Muslim, he was sold into the slave trade at that time, and we'll hear more about him. We could also hear about this extremely important individual, Osafakundi, who came from Ijebu, which was not an Oyo state, but was the state in the immediate interior of Lagos. And he is famous in history. This is a sculpture of him that was done in Paris. He was famous in history because his story was written down by a French anthropologist in the 1850s, in the 1830s. He was in Paris because he was purchased by a Frenchman in Rio de Janeiro and taken to Paris, where he became a subject for racist anthropologists at the time. Osafakundi actually was free when he was in Paris, but he chose in the 1830s to go back to Rio de Janeiro to be with his wife and children, and in doing so, he became a slave again. And this is our hero for the readings for this week, Samuel Jai Crowther, who was Oyo ethnically by origin, was enslaved in 1821. I'll give you a very brief overview of his biography, which is what you're reading anyway. He was probably born in about 1806. He came from a town called Oshogun, which was destroyed in 1821, 1822. As he describes, his father was a weaver. That is, he made those beautiful cloth that you see. His mother was a priestess for the Orisha Obatala. Obatala is the goddess of purity, and she was a descendant of Aleph and Abiodun, so she was of royal descent. With the outbreak of the uprising in 1817 that we'll look at in greater detail next week, their position, and because her mother was associated with one of the Orisha, they were subjected to harassment by the Muslims, and ultimately it resulted in their enslavement. You're going to be reading, you should have been reading, the account of his life and the introduction by one of the most important, now deceased, but one of the most important historians of Africa, Ajayi, the same name as Samuel Ajayi Crowther's middle name, his native name. Jacob Ajayi was one of the most important historians of African history, one of the pioneers. His interpretation of Crowther's relationship to the jihad is very different from my interpretation. I point that out because you will see that what he says, that it's not clear that this was associated with the jihad movement. In my interpretation, it was very directly associated with the jihad movement. In 1821-22, Crowther ended up on a ship on his way to Cuba, but he was intercepted by the British anti-slave trade patrols. He was taken off the ship and settled in Sierra Leone. He was baptized in 1825. He had an initial trip. He was taken by missionaries to London in 1826-27. He was taken there because he was obviously a bright young boy, and they wanted to show him off in Britain in order to get support for the missionaries that were working in Sierra Leone. He came back to Sierra Leone, to Freetown, and indeed he was the first student to be enrolled in Fora Bay College in 1827. He was an extremely bright and very good student. Fora Bay College still exists. It is now the University of Sierra Leone, and the Fora Bay College part of the university is still there. He was married in 1829 to a young woman who also came from Yoruba country and was Oyo by origin. In 1830, he was a student. He was a teacher at Fora Bay College, and he continued there in 1834. He's particularly important because he was one of the missionaries, and one of the things that has to be understood about missionaries at this time in Africa, very quickly, the great majority of missionaries were Africans. They were not white Europeans. They were people like Samuel Ajayi Crowther himself, who became a missionary himself for the Anglican Church and its association, the Church Missionary Society, as it was called in West Africa. And he therefore was involved in a series of British expeditions. The first important was an expedition up the Niger River in 1841-42. And in 1843, he published his first book, which was a book on the Yoruba language. And he is one of the pioneers who decided that even though he was Christian, he was going to call all people who spoke Yoruba, he was going to call them Yoruba, even though he knew that was a name that was the name that was used by Muslims to the north of Yoruba country. He's one of the pioneers who established the name Yoruba for the people. And he published his accounts of his expeditions up the Niger River, several books he wrote, but one of his most important was his book on the Yoruba language, which was published in 1843. He was then a missionary that went to Badagry and to Abeokuta in Yoruba country in 1845 and 1846 to found missions there. Both Badagry and Abeokuta became very important Christian centers where the Christianity, like Islam, were in direct opposition to the worship of Orisha. And remember that his mother was a priestess of Obatala, and therefore he had a major break with the worship of the Orisha. He was also involved in the Niger mission in 1857, And in the year 1864, the Anglican Church actually appointed him as Bishop of the Niger. He was the first African to become a bishop in the Anglican Church, and there wasn't another African who was a bishop or a high person in the Anglican Church until more than 100 years later. He died in 1881. So, very briefly, in terms of what you read about Jacob Ajayi's interpretation of Crowther's life, I disagree when he says that there was a 25 years of crisis before 1822. I disagree with his interpretation about the relationship to the jihad movement. Another Johnson, Samuel Johnson, I've shown here, who's another Anglican minister, another Yoruba in origin, with his wife, died in 1901, wrote an extremely important book in the 1890s, which was called The History of the Yorubas, which actually collects a lot of the traditions of the Yoruba of the 19th century. And here are pictures of Yoruba country today, showing Ibadan, showing Lagos. And you can see in the lower right-hand picture the beautiful, huge mosque, so that you see that the Christianity and Islam are both the dominant religions of these areas today, not Orisha worship. Orisha worship, as Santeria or as Candomblé, are dominant in Brazil and in Cuba, but much less so today in what